Morning, everyone. Michael Fisher back, the fear doctor. Let me explain the white coat. It's a symbol. It's also a very practical thing that I use, and you can have a look there. You can see I've used it in my painting career. I use these as smocks for painting, something I started way back in the early 80s, actually back even further than that. And then I've eventually sometimes used the coat in performances. And you can see one of my performances is that, people write all over it. There's words. Yeah. And I've used in that performance calling myself a fear doctor playfully because it's also a very serious thing. The use of the white medical lab doctor uniform, of course, is very powerful. It's very powerful in psychiatry, very powerful in just medicine itself. And so when we were looking at Desh Suba and I'll talk about that in a moment, how to bring in a fear process and a new way of understanding fear that would solve the problems of the fear disease that we have. And let me just put that down on the whiteboard here. The topic really today is about fear vaccines. And I'm very interested in what that might mean today. The words that Desh and I used were feariatry or feariatric. It takes a while to get your head around these terms, feariatric practices and theories. And these were all part of another term Desh and I used. So when I'm speaking about Desh, just to spell his name, I have mentioned him in my videos before. His work was on the philosophy of fearism. Around 1999, when he began to use that word, fearism, very important term that was to cast fear into study and using a different lens. And I've said this before, it's really a fearist lens that he used the term. So he said if we had a fearist lens to study fear, we'd probably come up with something new on fear. We'd see it in a new way. And I was studying the philosophy of fearism, creating it myself. And I was interested in creating a new lens, or what I call the fearless standpoint or a fearlessness lens on the same topic. So these are two of the lenses that we brought to the topic of fear. Okay, so now you just get a sense of the orientation. So let's go back to these three words over here. Oh, let me get the right tool. Guess it's this one here, right. So the white coat, today the topic is going to be on feariatry, but I'm going to be doing very practical examples. That's what I want to look at. Very practical examples of applying feariatric ideas, fear analysis, and fearism. So it's all of these, right? It's also fear analysis, but I'm not going to go into this one. Okay, that will be a whole other huge topic, and I actually teach a whole course on that at the Fearology Institute, which I'm the director and main instructor of, founder. But this term, fear vaccines, goes back a long way, and it's part of my original discussion is I thought about in somewhere around in the early 1990s, I was interested in, could I come up with a different notion of seeing fear, right, from this fearlessness lens that I was looking at, and come up with some kind of fear vaccine. And I put these marks on it because I opened that definition, as some of you may know, in my teaching. There's a difference between fear that's natural and fear that's culturally constructed. But for now, let's just leave it as fear vaccines wide open, which is, how to process fear and fear. And of course, by processing, I also mean healing fear. I'm not just interested in processing. I'm not just interested in coping. So I make a big distinction between healing fear and coping with fear. And the reason is because I'm really interested in a society that comes from the healing process. There's always going to be coping going on. I'm not saying that's bad. It's just not adequate to deal with the fear problem. This healing process is what leads to a liberation model. And that's where I come from, and Suba as well. We study fear. When we talk about fear, pretty much everything we say about it is part of a liberation process. And you can see it's slow to write out with this tool, but that's okay because liberation is very slow. So as fear doctor, playing this role in a way, and I play it as an artist, as you can see. I use this for art. I use it in my sort of scientific garb, in my clinical hat that I can wear as well as an ethical and philosophical hat that I wear. I was interested in a fear vaccine. So this fear vaccine would be, transdisciplinary. Which makes a big distinction, right? Between the discipline of medicine, psychology, sciences that feed into medicine and feed into psychiatry, and then psychology, the discipline of psychology of fear. And I've made that distinction many times that I'm interested in the transdisciplinary study of fear. So let's get the next word up here. What we have to put amongst three is feariatry, fear analysis, and fearology. So those become kind of a triad of, really a lot of interest to me and a lot of interest to Suba and others who are studying this philosophy of fearism applied to fear, philosophy of fearlessness, my approach applied to and joining with fearism to these three. Okay? So that's really what I'm interested in. So let's get back to the examples. I'm going to give sort of two examples today. I think we'll have time for. First one, it comes from a story from 4 Arrows. Four Arrows is also called Don Trent Jacobs. And I'm going to show you the book that I just finished writing a book on him and his work. Don Trent Jacobs, also called 4 Arrows in Lakota. He's an initiated Lakota indigenous sun dancer, actually. And he is also a scholar in Indigenous education at Fielding Graduate Institute of Leadership. And I've taken probably 10 years of studying his work off and on because he has a very interesting theory of fear, which I won't be specifying today. It's called CAT-FAWN, C-A-T-F-A-W-N, and that's a mnemonic for concentrated activated transformation, and fawn is fear, authority, A, W, word, and N for nature. These are what he calls the 4 great forces that the indigenous peoples, he says, for a very long time, in the primal condition, in the old ways of the indigenous people who are very connected and adapted to the land. That model he works with as a hypnotizing and dehypnotizing process. So I'm not going to go into that in this video. I'll do another video on that, but I just wanted to point out that, yeah, I've just done a 2.5-year study of his work intensely to write this book. And the story I'm going to share is from this book. So Trent Jacobs, 4 arrows, what he did, and really that was so interesting. In 1983, he experienced a near-death experience on a very remote whitewater kayaking trip in Mexico, and came across the Tahamuri or Rahamuri shamans of that area, and he ended going back there. They sort of half saved his life in that experience, and he had a lot of mystical experiences. And he went back there in his dissertation to study with these people. He thought that they just had really powerful skills that he wanted to learn about. And he ended up meeting a 104-year-old Augustin Ramos, who's the sort of a tribal shaman of that area. And that area had not been colonized by Catholicism and the Christian missionaries. So Four Arrows was studying this kind of like an anthropologist, but also as an educator, which he is. And he was very interested in how they haven't been affected by Western Christianity and values and worldview, and that maybe he could tap into the very primal worldview that they held, which he now calls an indigenous worldview. So Four Arrows outlines many characteristics of that worldview. He's a pan-Indian perspective, which means, you know, he acknowledges there's very big differences in different indigenous groups around the world, and even in with small areas. He's not trying to erase that diversity, and he says we need to be very conscious and aware of it. But he also says there are generalizations we can make about the indigenous worldview. So that leads to the story I want to share today. I'm just going to call it the little girl story. And the simplicity of this story was Four Arrows was talking to Augustin Ramos at one point. He was following her around, and I want to let you know that Four Arrows could not speak Raramuri, the language of those peoples, and the Raramuri shaman, Augustin Ramos, could not speak English. So sometimes Four Arrows had a translator who would come and help him interpret some of what Ramos was saying, but most of the time, Four Arrows just followed Ramos around, and Ramos went through the village, did all the things he did with the people. He was seen as their medicine man, if you want to call it that. He was also, what I'm going to say is he was the fair doctor. So the little story that Four Arrows tells is that as he was sort of telepathically communicating with Ramos, and this is what Four Arrows got into a bit of a hypnotic state, and he felt like he could communicate in this other world, a very subtle communication, and felt like he was reading. And Ramos said one day, "Follow me," and Four Arrows follows him up the path. Ramos was called to go to this particular house in the village in this very remote area, and Ramos went inside the house. Four Arrows sat outside, played with the children, taught them some games, and Ramos was in the house talking to the father, the mother for a long time, and then he learned that the little girl, and I think she was somewhere around 4 or 5, as I remember, the shaman comes out and he says, "Follow me." So what in this walking towards this area that Ramos was leading him to, Four Arrows was hearing and understanding from Ramos in this telepathic way that this little girl had been traumatized, and she was very ill. That's why Ramos was called. The parents called him because she was very ill. She was in a deep fever and was definitely not doing well. So Ramos, after he heard the story a little bit from the father and from, I don't know how much he got from the little girl, Ramos went off to this area. And this area was the edge of a cliff. And the little girl had been playing there all during the afternoon with her brothers. So her brothers were kind of maybe a few years older and so on, playing near the edge of the cliff. And apparently the little girl got close to the cliff and was just about to fall and got very scared, of course, and she was hanging on, by some kind of twig or something. And the boys yelled out some kind of phrases while she was in this very heightened state, right? A concentrated state of high alert, quote, high fear, hanging on for her life. And we don't know exactly what went on in the story. Foros doesn't tell it. Ramos did not tell the fine details. But what happened is all the kids eventually got back. Luckily, she didn't fall off the cliff. Got back to the home, and within a very short time, the little girl started going into these symptoms that were severe medical symptoms in the sense of so disturbing the parents called Ramos. Well, Ramos then, after he went to the cliff, he did this little ritual, and it involved various plant sources that were in the area, some kind of chanting prayers to the area, and from what Foros tells, as he sat and observed, Ramos was connecting with the environment and the beings in that place. Then Ramos had obviously prior ordered the father to bring the daughter back to this cliff after Ramos had done this ritual. The father and daughter come back. Ramos touches the daughter on the head, does a few more rituals. Then he takes the daughter over to the place where she just about fell. He sat her down, calmed her, and then he just moved back and let her be there. And then he did some other more ritual, which Foros doesn't tell the fine details of, which is fine. It's a sacred ritual. And the girl goes back with the father. Ramos and Foros follow, and within a very short time of hours, the girl's fever had gone. She was back being happy and joyful. And Foros at that point, he says to Ramos, and again, telepathic communication, asked Ramos, the indigenous shaman, what happened. And the shaman said she had gone to the cliff, she had just about fallen, and when she was in that state of high fear, the boys said some words to her that were not kind words. Maybe they said, "You're stupid, why'd you do that?" or "Why don't you fall?" Who knows the kinds of coarse words that could be said when the boys were actually in fear. And maybe they were just being tough and aggressive to handle that fear. And anyway, they said some things to her that were harmful when she was in that very frightened, terrified state. Foros, as a hypnotherapist as well as an indigenous educator, and many other things that he does in high performance training, he said that's where he learned from Ramos that in high concentration, the girl's soul, is the way Ramos put it, the girl's soul, part of her soul left because of this assault from the words while she was in this highly emergency state of a traumatic condition in fear. And the boys' kind of words, authority of being the older brothers, all created a power that was able to scare her so much, so deeply, that she, in some sense, dissociated, as we'd say in the world of therapy or psychiatry, dissociated a part of herself, split off. And that's a common phenomenon of defense of the psyche, or this, in maybe anthropological terms, we could call it soul. In spiritual terms, we could call it soul. But in just say straight psychological, scientific terms, we just call it the psyche, splits off. So in that tradition, what the shaman was doing, and often does, is they retrieve the soul. They find another pathway, a bridge through these rituals to bring the soul back into coherence again with the personality, the self, the psyche, in a more totality. And the girl's symptoms were relieved. She lived happily ever after, as far as we know the story. Forrest eventually came back and wrote a book on these shaman practices and the way this culture, the Raramuri, function. So that's one story of what I would call a fear vaccine. To get back to my whiteboard. This little girl story was a story of how the fear vaccine process works, and that was certainly an anthropological perspective that I just gave. And the spiritual, because the indigenous people do not make a separation between religion and spirituality and healing and therapy. They're all pretty much sort of one and the same for most of those kinds of cultures. And we in our society, of course, we separate those fields, and field of anthropology is over there studying things, and spirituality over there, and religion and psychotherapy over here. And so we have this fragmented knowledge often of this healing process that I talked about, which is also, as you can see, is a liberating process. This child, little girl, was liberated from her trauma related to fear and the high impact of the effect of others. So that's a point that I'll always come back to, is that fear is a social, cultural process. It's not just an individual psychological process. The story reveals the power of all her brothers, her parents, the shaman, all in a social construction, a social system that are involved with cultural practices, spiritual practices, therapeutic practices. All are involved in helping heal. And so this is kind of what Deshsuba and I would like to see in terms of this new practice of feariatry, which we've been labeling, or how to deal with fear diseases, how to create fear hospitals, as Deshsuba will use the term, to improve how we, in a transdisciplinary way, right, which is also, the other word for that is, I've used this holistic, integral approach to fear and fearlessness. That's really our goal, and it's the idea of building fear vaccines, designing them so that they can actually work on a transdisciplinary modality. And I think this would be a great boon to our society. Of course, this is theoretical, but I think we need it today, and Deshsuba is with me on that, as many others are probably starting to think of that. So fear vaccine is really just a kind of playful word, but it's also a very serious word, just like this white coat is a very playful thing, but it's also a very serious metaphor I'm playing for it with at the same time. So let's just clear this whiteboard. And I'll get to the next story. Next story starts in the 1990s, early, and I was on the internet and met a woman, psychotherapist. She was a family psychotherapist from Bogota, Colombia. Her name was Dr. Solarzano, Well, it was the weirdest thing. I mean, I just started the In Search of Fearlessness Center a few years, and I was starting to put some stuff online on the internet, and the internet was just starting in those days. And she picked up the fear vaccine, which I had used a fear vaccine process. So very quickly, our fear vaccine process at the In Search of Fearlessness Center and Research Institute consists of many things in the fear vaccine. I had identified that we need good information on fear and fearlessness. That was one part of the vaccine. We needed good peer counseling work with each other, and that's called LPC, or Liberation Peer Counseling. We needed good community conscious practices. And another part of the fear vaccine was sacred warriorship practices. And we even had a vision quest, etc. So several aspects that made the model for a fear vaccine. That was really what we were trying to do. And this is, of course, the most fundamental, where I believe that we have to start is we need good fear and fearlessness information. We need, what I've been talking about lately is we need good fear talks. And in some ways, the Augustin Ramos intervention and 4 arrows in the family was all part of talking about fear and talking about this little girl's fear in a very intimate way. Something that doesn't happen in our societies and the contemporary, at least I'll speak about the Western. So this next story, very short, very brief, is that when she contacted me, Dr. Solorzano from Colombia, she said, I'm really interested in your fear vaccine idea. She said, you know, I'm thinking of doing an intervention on Hallowmas, or Halloween Day, in that particular year. I think it was like 1991 or 92. And that's in Latin America, is called the Day of the Dead. So she told me what the problem was, that she was intervening, and she had some funding from the city of Bogota to do this project. So let me just walk through the project. It's absolutely fascinating. She said the problem has been the city of Bogota, and of course there's so much violence, and it has a reputation for a lot of violence. And on the Day of the Dead, which is supposed to be a festival of celebrating and connecting with the dead in the past, of course, is a very traumatic day. When you've had so much violence from gangs and drug wars, all the corruption that many of these places suffer from, and Bogota is one of them. Colombia, very challenged nation. For all those reasons, she said there's so much trauma on the day when it's supposed to be a festival that, you know, that she said the young people particularly just kind of go nuts, and they cause a lot of havoc and destruction. Of course, Halloween happens even in North America. There's a lot of vandalism and stuff, and it's sort of part of, well, it's kind of okay, but in Bogota it was getting pretty serious and pretty violent, and people are actually getting killed even on that day, and young people. So her plan was, as a psychotherapist, she got together and got this grant to say, could we do something different, like a fear vaccine? There's so much fear on this day because of the remembering of violence, right? The Day of the Dead, remembering the dead. And that brought back so much fear and terror back to people's experience. And it was collective. It just seemed to spread. And she said, this is why we need to intervene with this fear vaccine. So that's how her and I talked, and I gave her some ideas of how to do that fear vaccine. She also had a lot of her own ideas from her own position and with people she was talking with. Short of the story was, on what they did is they planned, they had a team of 50, 60 people, of therapists, social workers, psychologists, and so on, doctors. And this team set up a bunch of big tents on this square, a big park, where they were going to have a music festival. Day of the Dead, it's their regular festival, but it's going to be all these tents. And I think she said there's like 25 of them, these tents. And in each tent, the children would be lured in with balloons and clowns playing. The music would be going and be very festive, and the children could celebrate. But then the children could come into the tent, sometimes with their parents, or sometimes just if they're running on their own, or teenagers and so on, the young people they're focusing on. And they would come through the tent, and I'm only going to remember the finest, not the real details, but it was an intervention to deal with their fear. I think this is a marvelous and amazing example of a communal ritual. So not just Ramos and family. This was a whole society ritual in the city of Bogota. Brilliant, just brilliant. I've never heard of anything like it since. And they took the children through a series of interventions from, again, a sort of a playful, I think they had them do a drawing first of your fears in color. Then you took that to another person in the tent, and they were given a aromatherapy that was built and designed as an anti-fear aroma by people who knew what they were doing with these aromas to affect the sense of smell. So they used the visual memory process and the coloring process and the hands, then smell and the senses, and then they took them through a visualization of what your life would look like without fear. So the children could actually lay down and imagine and then come out, and then I think they did another drawing. And there was a series of these kinds of interventions within those tents. And she told me, as we communicated, they put 250,000 children through, in cities big, and through these tents in that day. Then the children were told to take their drawings, both of their fears and what fear would look like without, their life would look like without fears, and took their drawings to the final ritual in the evening. And there was a huge bonfire created. The bands were playing this very uplifting music, and they got the kids singing about being free of fear. So it's just fantastic, right? The arts, the sciences, the therapeutic, and the culture, bringing all of those into one ritual. And then the children were able to, at some point, take their drawings of fear and throw them into the fire, huge bonfire, while again the singing, chanting is going on. There's a kind of hypnotic state in the trance being induced, and great celebration and uplifting and support for these children who have been very traumatized, with many people killed in their lives and their families. And then they got to take home the drawings of their life without fear. I backed up with her and said I'd like to do a parallel ritual in Canada, and I did so and planned it with about 5 school teachers of grade 5 to 6 children, and had them draw. The teachers guided this experience. Draw a picture of your fears, one half of the page. The other half, draw a picture of your life without fear. What would it look like? And that's been a question I've long been interested in as an artist, is how do we imagine, what would it look like, and what does it look like, our life? Again, metaphorically expressed through the irrational domain of arts and imaginary. So once the children did these drawings, I had those brought to the In Search of Fearlessness Center downtown in Calgary, Alberta, where I lived in Canada. And we did a huge art display and invited the public and invited the children and their parents to come. And it was quite an interesting celebration. So that's the end of that story. I wanted to show you that both of those to me are fear vaccines. I'm not saying that they're built on the most sophisticated understanding of fear, as in from fearology, fear analysis, and feariatry, and fear philosophy of fearism, but they are moving along into more creative and communal and anthropologically based understandings of how to deal with fear. So thanks for listening to these stories today. I think you might want to maybe even listen to them again. I think there's interesting things that can be brought out, and we can improve on those and build better fear vaccines for the future. Okay, thanks for this today.